Perfect. Well, welcome everyone to tonight's CCL Mid-Atlantic Learning Series. This is a program we try to do roughly on a monthly basis to bring topics of interest to CCLers or anyone that joins us, or to share about other environmental organizations that may be of interest. If you're we're always looking for more people to present at these. So I'm going to drop my email in the chat. If you have topics for the future events you'd like to see, please let me know, because we're always looking to bring topics of interest that you guys would like to see. Tonight, we're being joined by Cliff Strawwich and Jeff Turner. They're going to give us a presentation on inroads in the IRA. They've put together a great presentation going over some of the policies and what their impacts on greenhouse gas emissions would be. This is going to be a qualitative assessment. And yeah, with that, I would just like to turn things over to Cliff. Oh, sorry, before I turn things over, they requested to hold your questions till the end so they can get through the material that they'd like to, but there will be some time for questions. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Cliff and Jeff. Thanks, guys, for joining us.
All right, let me start by sharing my screen, and then I'll pull up the presentation. Can you folks all see that?
Yeah.
Okay, very good.
Okay, so we're Cliff and Jeff, and we're from the Howard County, Maryland Citizens Climate Lobby Group. And tonight we're going to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, benefits using En-ROADS. Slide. Okay. So what is En-ROADS? En-ROADS is a powerful simulation model for exploring ways to address global energy and climate changes through large-scale policy, technological, and societal shifts. And the key word there is global. This is actually a global simulator. And of course, IRA only applies to the US, but we're going to do our best today. Okay. The MIT Sloan School of Management and Climate Interactive built En-ROADS using the best available science. And the model explores global climate from a systems perspective. It uses data sources such as the International Energy Agency and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And with En-ROADS, you can create scenarios that focus on how changes in taxes, subsidies, economic growth, energy efficiency, technological innovation, carbon pricing, fuel mix, and other factors impact global carbon emissions and temperatures. It's a very comprehensive model. All parameters and equations are shared open source, and En-ROADS is tested against a suite of climate integrated assessment models on a monthly basis. And actually, they test against reality too. Now, an example was in the last 10 years, they found that the use of renewable energy sources, such as solar and wind, have actually grown more than the model originally predicted. So what they did is they went back and they adjusted their equations and their graphs and things, and so it now shows that amount of growth in sustainable. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, what is En-ROADS model? It simulates policy effects on emissions and resulting temperature change by 2100. It uses the SSP2 baseline, which is a mid-level of emissions for greenhouse gases. And the baseline models the world where we do nothing about carbon emissions. In other words, business as usual. En-ROADS sliders allow exploration of the effectiveness of different mitigation strategies as measured by global temperature. So we're going to be using the sliders tonight and show you some changes and their effects. Okay, the next slide. Okay, now here's several disclaimers. I'm going to work actually from the bottom up on this slide. Since En-ROADS is a global simulator, in the En-ROADS results that follow, we're assuming that the world adopts the IRA provisions by following the United States. So in other words, we're trying to apply a global simulator to the US. Number two, the En-ROADS simulator can be used to give a qualitative look at the impacts of the IRA. In other words, the general direction we're moving in. And also, as we go, note the time delay of the impacts, because that's important. And then lastly on this, Cliff actually called Climate Interactive and asked them, and they responded that Climate Interactive has no plans to calculate the slider settings that model the Inflation Reduction Act impacts in detail. So it's going to be a generalized demonstration. Other organizations, however, have taken a detailed look at the impact of the IRA. And for example, the Rhodium Group. So go to the next slide, see what they say. Okay, so here's what the Rhodium Group estimates. On your vertical axis, you have US greenhouse gas emissions. On the horizontal axis, you have time. And the goal of the US Paris Agreement 2030 target is to get greenhouse gas emissions 50 to 52% below 2005 levels. Well, with business as usual, without the IRA, the Rhodium Group is estimating that the current policy will get us down around 24 to 35% reduction below the 2005 levels. And the figure I hear the most across models is about 25%. And then the Inflation Reduction Act, they're estimating that when these policies are all in place, it'll reduce US greenhouse gas emissions by around 31 to 44%. And the figure I hear the most on that is about 40%. So by itself, the IRA could reduce greenhouse gas emissions about 15% below the way that we're trending out. However, you will notice it doesn't get us all the way to the US Paris Agreement goals. Next slide. Okay, so how does the IRA cut climate pollution? Well, there's 6 main categories of climate pollution cuts achieved by the Inflation Reduction Act. Tax credits for clean energy sources like wind and solar, a fee on methane pollution, tax incentives for new and used electric vehicles, rebates and tax credits to its homeowners in electrifying and making their homes more energy efficient, funding for natural climate solutions like forests and agriculture, and investments in clean technology, innovation, and manufacturing. So what we're going to do now is Cliff is going to start showing you the groupings of the sliders and what they measure in the simulator. And then we'll start moving some sliders around to show you the effects of the IRA.
Okay, thanks,
Cliff.
Jeff. Okay, this next chart is extremely busy. And so what I'm going to do, I stuck it in the hard copy. So, folks would have a reference, but I'm actually not going to go through this. What I'm going to do instead is actually go through the IRA. So hopefully you can see that now. Excuse me, I'm through the En-ROAD simulator. Can you folks see that?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Okay, let's see. Let me just do this one thing here. Okay. All right, so En-ROADS has 18 policy sliders that are located in 6 groups. In the energy supply slider, which is shown right here, hopefully you can see that annotation.
Yes, that's great.
Yeah, very good. In the energy supply grouping, you can set policy to incentivize or disincentivize the use of fossil fuels and renewables. And of course, the carbon pricing lever is in this group, as you'd expect. It also has something called New Zero Carbon, which is kind of a hopeful new technology. Should someone magically invent a new zero carbon power source, you could actually model it with this slider. Doesn't exist right now. Perhaps thorium fission, perhaps nuclear fusion, although my background is nuclear fusion, and I can tell you that nuclear fusion is at least 50 years away, probably more than that. Okay, the transport group, which is shown here, okay, includes efficiency and electrification, as does the buildings and industry group, which is shown right here, for example, okay. In the land use and industry emissions group right here, okay, you can influence deforestation policy as well as methane and other industrial emissions. This is critically important groups, and it includes methane emitted from agriculture, for example, from livestock, as well as fugitive emissions from pipelines, from gas pipelines, because natural gas, after all, is essentially methane. The carbon removal group includes nature's version of carbon removal, which is to say afforestation. It also includes the high-tech version, which in this case includes carbon capture and storage through various technologies, including direct air capture. Right now, CCS is pretty speculative, even though it is technically feasible. The instances I've read about show basically it's been abandoned because it's very expensive, and it actually increases the amount of energy you've got to spend to extract that CO2. And lastly, down here, one I've skipped so far is the growth slider. Let's see, let me find my narration here. There's the growth group, which includes policy levers for population and economic growth, two areas that are very controversial, and I typically avoid them, okay? Finally, if we look up here, you can see there's two plots, one here, and right now I'm showing global sources of primary energy, and I'm showing net greenhouse gas emissions. And these plots will change in real time once you begin sliding the sliders, okay?
And this is the business as usual
Yes.
view right now. So
That's right.
if nothing was done, global global temperature by 2100 would increase by 3.6 degrees centigrade or 6.4 degrees Fahrenheit. And the reason the centigrade's bigger than the Fahrenheit is, number one, that's a global model. And number two, the Paris Agreement, which I think there's a dot to show you, is actually also measured in centigrade. So that's why centigrade is emphasized in the model.
Right. So, okay, so I'm going to start sliding the sliders, but before I do that, I'm going to, on this greenhouse gas net emissions, I'm going to show you the UN pledges, this little red dot right here. So if we look at the annotation showing a description, the show UN pledges NDC option in the graph actions menu indicates the approximate level of emissions in 2030 if all countries were to follow their emissions reduction pledges. This reflects NDCs, and now NDCs are nationally determined contribution submitted by countries to the UNFCCC as of November 2021. Okay, so that's a good thing if we can meet that. So let's begin moving sliders. So one thing the IRA clearly incentivizes the renewables. Let's increase renewables and see what the impact is. Okay, you can see the global temperatures drop by 0.2 of a degree, and you can see that some of the fossil fuels have decreased and the renewables have increased. Now, one of the unfortunate things in the IRA, of course, is that they're going to slightly increase coal, oil, potentially, and natural gas emissions. Okay. There is some subsidies for nuclear, so we're going to include a little bit of an increase in nuclear power. There is substantial investment. Let's see, let me find there we go. Fair amount for energy efficiency. Quite a bit more for electrification. You can see the impact on the global temperature. And building an industry, there is substantial funding to incentivize. You can see that has a big impact. And electrification of building the industry is also something that's incentivized with the taxes. They do incentivize afforestation, growing new trees. There is, let me move my picture here so I can see methane. There is some, of course, there is the methane fee. Now, one of the things that was interesting when I attended the RFF seminar is I was talking about that previously. The RFF seminar, Rhodium group showed up, and as did the Energy Innovation and the Princeton Zero group, and of course RFF has their own simulation. They all agree that calculating the amount of methane reduction based on the fee is going to be very problematic. So they were loath to include too much of an increase in, or a decrease, I should say, of methane emissions. Okay. Let's see. Finally, we might include a little bit of carbon capture and storage, although that's somewhat problematic as well. So you can see where are we? We've done a pretty good job of reducing fossil fuels. Renewables are increased somewhat. You can see our global temperatures dropped from 3.6 to 2.7 degrees centigrade. These are all positive things. So the IRA is certainly a good thing. One of the things you notice right away, though, is that we are not meeting the NDCs. The primary reason for that is a lot of these changes, when you incentivize renewables, the problem is the lifetime of coal, oil, and natural gas-fired power plants are actually 30 years. So it takes a long time for that effect to occur. These changes are actually occurring in 2022. So they're actually starting back here somewhere. So you can see it takes quite a long time for those changes to occur. How can we speed things up? I mean, obviously it's desirable to speed things up. One thing we could certainly do is impose a carbon price. Watch this, folks. It's just amazing. So if we put a carbon price in place, we can actually exceed the NDCs by 2030. Look at what happens to the various fossil fuels. They get hammered down substantially. Of course, renewables are incentivized as well. And by the way, that carbon price is in addition to all the other changes we've already made. So this shows you the power of a carbon price. And so this is a good justification for CCL to keep pushing for carbon price right on top of all the incentives that exist in the IRA. Okay. So pretty powerful. Now, one more thing I wanted to show you is if you actually look at the impacts, for example, another benefit, of course, is if I look at air pollution by energy source, you can see that there's a dramatic decrease in PM 2.5. So there'll be substantial health benefits from imposing all of this. In fact, even if you turn off the carbon tax, okay, there's still a pretty substantial reduction in PM 2.5, but the carbon tax has a big effect on all of that, okay?
And so that helps people's health quite a bit. And, people with asthma, et cetera, that would really help them. So what it does is it goes to some of the environmental justice benefits that are in the IRA. Exactly.
Notice we're still not achieving 1.5 by the end of the century. To do that, we'd have to perhaps crank up deforestation. There's actually other legislation right now that I think is trying to address deforestation. Perhaps crank up our methane gas reduction a bit. Maybe increase afforestation to the max. What else? We could also, we can increase energy efficiency, electrification. Has a big impact on both vehicles and transport. See, we're almost there. So if we were to crank up our technological carbon capture and storage a little bit, we can actually achieve end of century 1.5 degrees Celsius. And look what it's doing to fossil fuels. It's just bringing them down dramatically as opposed to the business as usual case. Okay. All right, that's what I wanted to show you. Let me go back to the pitch now. Hopefully you can see that, folks. Okay, our conclusions. The Inflation Reduction Act is a huge step for the US and will take us a long way on the path to net zero, with numbers like 40% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030. Unfortunately, due to the long timescales, retired power plants, typically 30-year lifetime, changes don't happen fast enough to meet President Biden's pledge to achieve 50% reduction with respect to 2005 levels by 2030. So to get us to President Biden's goal, we need to implement further policies, and a price on carbon is an attractive approach, since its impacts will be felt very quickly and will apply to something like 80% of the sources of greenhouse gases. So that's it.
So the moral of the story that we'd like you to take away from this is that with the IRA, things are moving in the right direction, which is good. However, Citizens Climate Lobby should not rest on their laurels. They should keep pushing for a carbon price, because that's going to make an enormous difference in the reduction of pollution.
Right. That's pretty much it. Now I've got a couple of things here. This is the energy innovation predictions. You can see also best case 41%. And then finally, the Princeton Repeat Lab, their Repeat is the name of their code. Zero Lab is what they call themselves. And you can see also numbers approximately like 40% below as well. So they all are in pretty good agreement with that. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing here. And now take your questions.
Yeah.
So David.
Yes, thank you first off for explaining this. I have a bunch of questions and relationships, but let me get specific. Is hydrogen an example of a new energy supply? For example, if hydrogen becomes a fuel for transportation, would that be an example of a new energy supply for that slider group?
That's a good question.
Okay,
That's a
well,
good
no,
question.
so
And to be
that
honest
was
with you, I'm
one
not
question.
sure about that. Let me actually open up the simulator again.
A lot of these questions are buried deep within the data, and it does explain as you dive deeper and deeper. So maybe we can find that answer around a little bit.
What we can do is we can actually go down to the new zero carbon slider. And here's some text associated with that. So the new zero carbon is discovering a brand new cheap source of electricity that does not emit greenhouse gases. Some speculate such a breakthrough could be nuclear fusion or thorium-based nuclear fission. Or there are known risks associated with any new energy supply. So initial cost relative to coal and how long. So actually, I think it could be. Certainly, the problem with hydrogen, though, is my understanding is the way that works is you actually apply electricity to water, for example, that actually dissociates the H2O and creates hydrogen and oxygen. Okay, so it is not really an energy source. It's a way of storing energy. So I'd have to say that no, it doesn't apply to hydrogen.
Okay. Also, I'm assuming there's a relationship between one slider and another. Meaning if you change a percentage from one of the sliders,
Yes,
in reality, there's a ripple effect.
absolutely.
And this model doesn't even try to predict what those changes would be.
No, that's not true. It turns out it does actually include those interactions.
Can you explain to me how it does that?
Maybe go back to baseline and show some of the things.
Well, this thing, my understanding is this thing is actually solving some ungodly number of differential equations in real time.
Oh,
So, and some of them are coupled as well, meaning that one change affects the other. Let's go back and see if we can actually demonstrate that.
I always had difficulties with diffie-qs.
Ah, okay. Well, I'm a physicist, and so I like diffie-qs, but in fact, my thesis was solving coupled partial differential equations okay, here's
Where were you when I needed you?
Okay, let's see, what can we do? If we go back to, let me turn off, I don't know, let me just turn off these changes due to fossil fuels, for example. Let's actually go back to zero, reset the entire thing. And let's look at the impact of a carbon price just by itself. Pretty dramatic, right? 2.6 degrees or thereabouts. Now look what happens if we actually at this point, enhancing or incentivizing renewables is not going to have much effect, because it turns out the carbon fee does a great job of incentivizing that. Okay, we can perhaps get some additional benefits from electrification, not so much. Energy efficiency, we see another bit of a change there. Let's see, how much was that? Only 1/10 of a degree. Let's see what happens with that one change. If we increase the energy efficiency of buildings, for example.
Hey, Cliff.
Yeah.
Could you maybe on the left graph go back to show the general by source thing, because what you can see with the things you're changing, there you go, is to show how the colored wedges change. When you make energy efficiency, for example, that actually reduces all of the different sources of energy because it makes them more efficient. You get more bang for the buck, so to speak.
Well, it turns out that a carbon price actually does that as well. Watch this. If I turn
But on the
on-
other hand, some of the things Cliff was explaining, yeah,
So if we
There
go
you
back
go.
and if we do just renewables, for example, you can certainly see the slice from renewables has increased quite a bit. Look what happens now if I just turn on a carbon price. You'll see renewables grow tremendously, but more importantly, the fossil fuels shrink dramatically, okay? So our carbon price is actually a better thing to do to incentivize the use of renewables.
But I don't see the slider change for the other energy supplies when the carbon price goes up. I would expect, for example, the use of oil to change and the demand to go down.
These sliders do not show the actual use of oil and coal and natural gas. What they're showing is whether you incentivize, move it to the right, you're actually subsidizing or incentivizing. Move it to the left, you're actually taxing it. Okay, so you wouldn't expect these things to move. Okay,
So
these
Cliff,
sliders-
I think there are individual energy slides. Where is it? I'm trying to
They're-
remember now. They do have that, David, where they show like how it goes down and up. It's hard to see when you see all of it together.
the sliders don't show the interaction. What shows the interaction are the plots, Sabrina.
Okay.
No, but there's
Thank
a graph that has individual energy source.
That's what this is.
no. What she's saying is the individual graph for coal,
Oh,
Yeah, I think you can go to
individual
view.
graph
Yes,
for
Yeah.
oil,
exactly.
you know,
Yes.
let's see.
to show those that they
Let's see, primary energy demand. Let's see, primary.
pipes. I
By
think that's
type,
it.
yeah, primary energy
Types.
demand by type. You were there.
So if I do, so for example, coal, for example, so we're now at business as usual. Look what happens if I institute a carbon price. Okay,
Is that what you wanted to see, David?
I don't think it is. I
Yes.
think-
Yes.
is
Okay.
it?
Yes,
Okay,
thank you.
Very good.
Yes.
Like renewables, same sort of thing, although not as dramatic.
The greenhouse gas net emissions graph on the right does, if you change multiple sliders, you don't see the contribution of that individual slider. You have to keep everything status quo and just move the one variable to see the impact.
That's exactly right. That's
Right.
exactly right. In fact, we just saw the example, whereas if you do the renewables by themselves, rather modest decrease in coal consumption. But if you put a carbon price in place, much more dramatic, right?
Okay, but you have to do it on an individual basis to
That's
see.
correct.
Okay,
What-
and I'm sorry. One more question,
Sure.
and that is the energy demand curve is not taken into account here, is it?
Well, it is. I
For
mean, if you look
example, I'm expecting the energy demand from oil, just from pure economics, to decrease.
okay, here's oil
Look
primary
at
demand.
that.
Now, if I put in a carbon price, for example,
Well, look at that. Beautiful. Beautiful.
in fact, it's a bit deceptive because you notice the scale is changing as well. Right now, this looks like this is right around 258. Watch what happens if I slide the carbon price slider. The scale actually decreases as well.
Yes.
So it's
Yes.
pretty dramatic. Okay.
Yes.
You can do the same thing if you actually tax oil. Let's see, oil. If you actually tax oil, same thing happens, right? Okay. All right.
And I've just one more question, and I
Sure.
appreciate the time. Subsidies. The oil and gas industry have many subsidies, and it comes in various forms.
Yep.
I know that renewables have subsidies, but it's not nearly yet on the magnitude of
right.
fossil fuels.
That's right.
Is the subsidies a dial that can be tweaked?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a slider, yes, that, so if you take the oil slider and you move it to the right, that
Yeah,
is subsidizing additional subsidies of oil.
Right.
And in fact, as Cliff said, this IRA does have additional incentives for oil and natural gas,
Yeah, they're not
but it's
really
about a
incentives.
24-to-1 ratio. So in other words, the amount of
Ah.
decrease due to the changes of the IRA and greenhouse gas emissions will be about 24 times more than the increase due to expanding the subsidies for oil and natural gas.
Yeah, it's not that
Is it
we're
a
actually, it's not
Is it
that
a
we're
simple
actually incentivizing.
generalization to say moving the oil slider to the left, which is increasing taxes, is a simple equivalent to saying reducing of subsidies?
Yes,
Thank you. And thank you for the time for me to ask the questions.
sure.
And actually, if you drill down under the oil slider, it'll actually allow you to change the assumptions so that you can say how much of a subsidy you want or how much of a tax you want, what the time frame will be. Will it be kick in 5 years, 10 years, or how long will it last for? So they have a lot of these individual things that you can adjust.
I'm actually looking at the assumptions right now because the model is nice because you can actually adjust some of the assumptions. Now here, I see renewable subsidies is here, so you can adjust those. I'm looking for actually reducing existing, I mean, you're absolutely right. There's billions of dollars worth of subsidies for fossil fuels right now. Unfortunately, I don't see anything to actually reduce the existing subsidies, but of course, by sliding this, as we've already observed, you're actually effectively decreasing them, I guess.
Cliff, I think if you hit the 3 buttons by, let's say, oil, for example, okay, then it drops, and here you go. So you hit there you go. See, there's the amount of tax, the amount of subsidy. So you can vary the amount of tax or subsidies you're applying, and you can say what year you want it to start, what year you want it to stop, et cetera. And then, and that'll help to fine tune it if that's what you want to look at.
Right.
Thank you for allowing me to ask the questions.
Sure, by all means.
We love it.
Other questions? Silence.
Okay, I'll ask another question.
Okay,
Please do. This is great.
I noticed over in the bottom right, there was a way to submit your scenario.
Yes. Let me share again. Sorry about that. I probably should not have unshared, but
Yeah, I would just keep sharing it, and the gallery's on the side if you have that view. So
what you can
Still see
do,
David.
what you can do there, David, is you can actually go over to here, and you can actually you can share it by email. You can actually copy the scenario, for example, and what you get is you get a big long link that if you click on it or someone else clicks on it, they can actually reproduce the exact scenario you've actually been playing with.
On the bottom right, it says register oh, that's just for an event. I'm sorry. Never,
Right. The En-ROADS folks like you to register their event, and I have to confess, I didn't register tonight's event. I probably should have, but the folks they get their grants from like to know that people are actually using the tool. So that's one of the reasons you should register your En-ROADS event. But as far as sharing links, this is the way to do it right here.
Great.
In fact, what they look like, if I go back to my, that's what they look like. So I've got two built into this this presentation, the IRA with no carbon tax and the IRA with a carbon tax. So that's what they look like, okay? All right, other questions?
There are some questions in the chat, I believe.
Oh,
gosh, 22
Well,
comments.
no,
at least.
I can summarize the question in the chat, but why don't you have Linda ask hers? She has her hand up.
Oh,
okay. Linda.
Yeah, I was wondering about the forestry because I think that I saw an article in the Washington Post said that Inflation Reduction Act has money for a lot of conservation.
It does.
So I don't know really if that could go, if it's really conserving existing forests, hopefully
I think it's for afforestation and also for carbon capture by farmers, by using no-till farming, for example. So you can include all of that in here. Okay,
That's what the money's for.
I believe
so
so.
there-
Yeah,
So they're not gonna like have the government buy existing land that's forested and protected. They're gonna buy areas that don't have trees. Will you say
I'm not sure about that.
it's planting trees where there's no trees, right?
That's what afforestation is. That's right.
Yeah.
Now, there's separate legislation. Was it the Forest Act that actually is trying to penalize people that are engaging in deforestation in Brazil, in the rainforest, for example? So deforestation, of course, is reducing the amount of slash and burn agriculture that's occurring in the Amazon basin right now. Anyway,
Well, we deforest in this country. We turn forests into developments on a regular. It's like there was a op-ed in the Washington Post saying the government should buy, like there's a bunch of Boy Scout land since Boy Scouts are in bankruptcy court.
yeah,
That's pristine land that's going on sale, and
Right.
unless the government buys it, it's probably going to be turned into developments.
in fact, I read somewhere that the rate of deforestation in Canada actually exceeds the deforestation in the Amazon rainforest.
Wow.
Interesting.
Wow.
I've got to check on that. I'm not sure I believe that. That seems kind of incredible.
Yeah, I think there's significant deforestation in temperate forests, Russia also.
Yeah, boreal forests up in Canada.
Boreal forests, that's right, and in
Yep.
Russia.
Yep. Okay, there were other questions in
Cliff
the
and
chat.
Jeff?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm going to summarize two questions. There's just a lot of chat with people sharing with each other, such as with the Kigali agreement and stuff, that you don't necessarily have to address. But there are really two questions that I can see that's directly related to what you're presenting. And one of them is from Leslie. And I sort of answered the question, but I just wanted to confirm. Leslie asked, for methane, does the model include natural emissions? Oh, can whoever has a noisy background? Okay. So Leslie's question is that for methane, does the model include natural emissions from melting permafrost among other sources? And I assume that she meant, actually I misinterpreted her question. I thought she was talking about the methane leaks from the, that we're trying to address through the IRA. So Leslie, I assume you mean the model for, now I think I see that you mean the model from En-ROADS. And feel free to unmute yourself.
Go ahead, Cliff. You want to speak to what you're showing?
I don't think so. I think it does not include methane emissions from melting, permafrost, nor does it include emissions from methane ices, which are under the ocean. I don't think
Or
they're
from
in there
cows,
yet.
or from cows. I think, anything that's sort of
No,
like,
it's got the methane emission from cows. It does have
oh,
that.
it does. This
Yeah,
one,
it does have the agricultural, right?
okay, which includes cows. I thought that was only from the rice paddies and stuff. So
No,
that's
it does
interesting.
include cow burps. Yes.
Okay.
It looks like they actually do include permafrost. It's under climate sensitivities and the assumptions.
Oh, great job, Thad. Methane and other gases.
So if I go to the assumptions,
Yeah, I think it's climate system and sensitivities. I think at the bottom it has stuff for
Oh, yeah.
permafrost.
Yep.
oh yeah,
Great
the
job there.
This is an amazing simulator. The more
is.
you dig through it, the more you discover. And
I have
it's
to admit, I
nice
did
that-
not
that you
know
brought
that
that
was
to-
there.
Impressive.
So it looks like you can put in the temperature threshold for permafrost and something called clathrates. I guess that means the melting temperature perhaps, or where they're going to begin emitting. So if you change that, for example, actually lower it, I don't see a whole lot of impact.
Oh, yeah. Well, right next to it.
Well, it
Oh,
certainly does that, yeah. What
oh,
I'm
I
looking for is greenhouse gas emissions.
Right.
See much change upstairs.
I think you have to change the slider above it as well.
Effects of temperature on methane emissions. Good point.
Methane emissions or biological activity. I don't know. Now that's
Oh,
that's
Yeah,
having
no,
an
there's a
effect,
lot going on.
that drove it
there.
up.
right? I must confess, I don't know what these are doing exactly. I'd have to actually look into it, but let's put it back to where it was. So it
Okay,
looks like you could potentially model methane ice and permafrost methane emissions.
One of the things about methane as it applies to the IRA that's a little bit hopeful is there is some hope that even though it's not a huge amount of impact from the IRA, it does open the door and set the precedent that, you can legislate the reduction of a gas. And once that's kind of, agreed upon, then it might open the door more
Well,
yeah, great point,
to
Jeff. about
acceptance
the-
of a carbon price.
right,
down the
people
road.
might become more comfortable with that. Of course, there is no cash rebate from the methane price, but perhaps it would kind of normalize the idea of pricing gases we don't like to have in the atmosphere.
Those are great points. I'd like to ask a question from the chat from Robert Loeb. And
Sure.
Mike, I think, is next. So Bob Loeb asks, what are the specific incentives in the IRA to encourage power companies to increase the percentage of clean energy sources?
I could not answer that for you right now. You'd have to look at one of the detailed, the CCL actually has a very detailed summary of the legislation on community. They've got a sort of a top level summary and they've got a detailed summary that's really detailed. It's, it's probably 30 pages of, and I've not looked at it in great detail. I began to read it and then I kind of fell asleep, to be honest, but let me refer you to that. I think that would provide your answer.
I heard recently that there are more pages in the IRA than there are in all the Harry Potter novels.
Yeah,
combined.
I heard the same
So it's
thing.
in there somewhere, Robert. We just don't know where
Yeah.
it is.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me ask just a quick follow-up to that. Does the En-ROADS model take into account the increased demand for power as a result of consumers being incented to switch to EVs and more electrical appliances? In other words, as the consumer incentives increase, does it take into account what the effect of that increased electrical demand for power?
Actually, it does. For example, if you incentivize renewables, it's possible that the price of power would decrease, right? That, in fact, could have a rebound effect and actually make people demand to use more power because it's cheaper. And actually, it does include that effect. Yes. Other questions?
Cliff,
How does this tool, the results of this tool, align with the Zero Labs and the Rhodium group and the third group that you?
So David, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Mike and Cheryl had their hand up. So do you mind?
I'm
Yeah,
terribly
no.
sorry.
No, if you could
Sorry.
hold that question, I'd like to try to give Mike.
No
and-
problem.
Thanks.
Mike Wilkove,
hey
greetings.
there. Okay, this is going to be a far less technical question because I'm not a physicist, but I was struck by the effect that a carbon price, that the effect that the model shows a carbon price could have on temperature. Were there any other items that could be addressed to a legislature that could have as big or close as big of an impact as carbon price might?
Well, it's interesting. The folks at Climate Interactive thinks that is the most powerful lever. Carbon price, without any sort of influence from CCL, based on their model, they very quickly zeroed in on the carbon price as being the most powerful lever. So I think, unfortunately, there is not anything as powerful as a carbon price.
Something else that's very powerful by itself is if you're able to really, really reduce methane and other gases. That helps a lot.
Okay, thanks.
Let's have a look at that, actually. So if we go with the carbon tax there and we really crank up the methane reduction, Okay, let's actually turn off the carbon price. And then do that. Oh, still turning off the carbon price.
So basically, it's just trying to keep the bad gases out of the atmosphere.
Let's reset. And we'll go to the methane price alone. Not as
Not
dramatic,
as much, but still a help.
still powerful. Right. Yeah, I've attended a number of seminars where the Climate Interactive folks make it very clear they think that carbon price is by far the most powerful lever that they've discovered.
Well, you're certainly preaching to the choir here on that.
I
Well,
know, I know.
But again, part of what we're hoping to get across is,
Mhm.
I think there's a tendency to go, oh, well, okay, IRAs,
All done.
been passed, we can rest now. When in fact, we need to keep pushing for that carbon.
Right. Yeah, both Jeff and I completed the En-ROADS ambassador training. And both of us heard, I'm sure we're delighted when we heard from them that they felt the carbon price lever was the most powerful lever. I mean, that was very rewarding for me because it makes me think CCL is certainly onto something, We're not just drinking our own bathwater,
Oh, that's gross.
That is gross.
Are you guys ready for Cheryl's question?
Yes.
She had-
Yes.
Okay.
So, because it's in the news today, and I don't know if I've got the technical term right, fluorocarbons, hydrofluorocarbons, blah, 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 the cooling gases.
Yeah.
This model, because I read that by the change that this Kigali Treaty will cause could actually have a substantial effect on greenhouse gas emissions. Those cooling gases, when they leak, they're very powerful greenhouse gases as well.
Yep.
So I'm wondering if that's already in the model, or do you have to model the reduction that's going to be caused by the Kigali Treaty, say on the methane and quote, other gases lever, or is it already part of the assumption?
It's not part of the assumption right now,
already
Cheryl,
begun.
but you're right. They are, methane is, I think, 81 times more powerful. Greenhouse gas are 87, I forget, than carbon dioxide. Well, these HFCs and CFCs are even much worse than methane. They're
Oh, really?
spectacular greenhouse gases.
Oh my goodness, then we really
What
got.
I've done here is I pulled
somehow.
open the methane and other gases. If you look down here, you can actually click on use detailed settings. So here is agricultural and waste emissions, which is methane and nitrous oxide. Here you can actually put a limit on not only methane and nitrous oxide, but the F gases. That's the various fluorine gases. Yes. Okay. And then you can actually put into this thing a programmed HFC phase out, just like you would with a carbon tax, for example.
Well, in your presentation, I think especially because that's in the news, and maybe we're about to get an actual treaty signed by the US as well as, I think I read 137 other countries that already passed this treaty. Maybe emphasizing that and the effect that that treaty is going to have, you could integrate that into what the Inflation Reduction Act is doing.
Well, we could, but this was specifically for the IRA. So, yeah. In fact, it might be interesting to put together a presentation that includes the effects of all the recent legislation,
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so. Other questions?
One thing that was also in the paper today that I found very interesting, excuse me, was that the Republicans seem to have lined up as a block to try to, believe it or not, stop the additional subsidies and things for oil and natural gas that are in the IRA because they're mad at Joe Manchin for doing a compromise to get this thing passed. So they just decided we're not going, even though they've been pushing for the additional land to drill oil and explore for natural gas and all that, and approve the pipeline running through West Virginia. They got mad at Joe Manchin, so they said, we're not going to, agree on the additional little funding or whatever it is to, provisions, I guess that's the word I'm looking for, to actually accomplish those things. So it's kind of unusual. They're just out of spite. They're
Wow.
working against themselves.
Oh, children.
That's amazing. That's amazing. That's very interesting. I mean, I don't think there's incentives for coal, oil, and gas. What there are is they're opening up new areas for exploration. And so at this RFF seminar, one of the things they said, which was kind of interesting, they said that, there's going to be some land opened up for exploration, both on land and in the oceans. They said that their models typically include a worst case where they assume that every well they drill produces, not coal, but oil and gas. They said that's typically not true. It's some small percentage of the wells that are drilled are actually productive. Okay, so some of their predictions are probably a bit pessimistic. So that's very interesting. Yeah, I'm mad at Joe Manchin too, but
One
anyway.
of the issues being raised today was about the permitting, that the Republicans were changing
What it is, the permitting.
about shorter periods for permitting, 2 months rather than 3 months. And well, anyhow, I thought maybe that was part of the issue.
And they're opposed to that.
Changing their mind about. Look, I'm not an expert on this, but it's in the.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. I'll have to look for that, but that's interesting. Other questions, folks?
David has his hand raised.
Okay.
Thank you. A question and 2 comments based on what was just said. First, the question is, how does this model compare with the one from the zero group at Princeton and the one for rhodium? And you had also mentioned a third group.
Well, there's rhodium, there's RFF, there's energy innovation,
That was the one.
and finally the Zero Lab at Princeton.
Yes.
Okay, they all have their own integrated assessment models. The answer is I don't have a detailed comparison for you. In fact, when I wrote my email to the Climate Interactive folks, I was hoping they might tell me what the detailed settings to use are. But the problem is the problem is all of the predictions from rhodium and climate and energy innovation are all for the US. Whereas this is a global simulator. So you can't do a direct comparison, unfortunately.
Understood.
Okay.
First comment is a generalization of the comments that were made about the impact on carbon price. In talking about decarbonization, there are some heated discussions around certain facets, one of which is carbon capture and removal.
Yes.
And there's people that say we're wasting resources that could go to better things. From someone who's managed portfolio of projects, there's always resource constraints. And I think the value of these models with carbon price impact as an example can help with prioritization of where those resources go. So very simply, if you only have $100 and you need to figure out where to spread the $100, it's models like these that could provide insight onto where you get the most bang for your buck. So that was one comment I wanted to make. The second is with regards to oil economics. There was comments made just earlier about, well, remember with this permitting, just because you drill a hole in the ground doesn't necessarily mean that something comes up.
Right.
Part of my formal education is I do have a degree in petroleum engineering.
Oh, really?
I was a reservoir engineer for Exxon in Houston. So I'm very well familiar with the economics of drilling an oil well. And I'll oversimplify by saying that there's 2 types of wells. There's a well that's drilled in a known oil field and you're developing the well. And in those cases, the chances of getting something out of the ground could be 60, 70%, which means minus 100% tells you you're not always going to get something.
Right.
And if you're going after a new field, your percentage is about 30%.
Wow.
And even if you find something, meaning if you drill a hole in the ground and something comes up, doesn't mean it's economic to develop it, because it's a business. It
Right.
costs me X number of dollars to drill the well. It's going to cost me X number of dollars to deliver my product to market. What's the price of oil?
Right.
And if the price of oil doesn't substantiate the costs, even though you could get something out of the ground, doesn't necessarily mean you will develop it.
That makes sense.
So this is my own personal opinion. So when it comes to the permitting and the relaxation of them, people are missing the point. Economics will kill the fossil fuel industry. But what is bothersome about the relaxation or the I forget the euphemism they're putting, the readjusting of the permitting process is, and this is just my opinion, is the exclusion of public input, either by limiting the amount of time the public can input into a development project or excluding it altogether.
Huh.
So if a developer wants to develop an oil field on land and it's impacting other people, well, those people have, by law, an opportunity to put inputs, just like a housing development. The
Right.
public can say traffic is going to increase, my property value goes down. That same type of input can happen in developing resources on land that people are going to be impacted. So what Manchin, and I'm second guessing him, what Manchin's looking to do is to reduce the opportunity for that criticism, because that criticism means extra costs that go into the project. Oh, the developer for a housing development now has to build a football field for the town or build a new school for the additional students that are now going into the town. So what Manchin's trying to do by streamlining the process, that's the word, is that he's trying to limit the amount of public input. And so this gets into the justice part, the energy justice part of decarbonization. So I'll get off my podium now. So economics is going to kill fossil fuels. That's not a question. It's a question of whether it kills it in time. What the reformatting, the streamlining of the permitting process is really to try to limit the amount of scrutiny and the number of eyeballs that are on plans. I'll get off my podium now.
Thank you.
That's
Thank
very
you,
interesting,
David.
though. Thank you, Dave.
Very interesting.
I will say this permitting issue is definitely something of concern. CCL is kind of waiting until we see what's in the bills to have an official opinion. And we should see in the next week or so. So you'll likely see a CCL stance in the near future, but we're still waiting to see what comes out of it because we like to go with the science before jumping on a train. It's just a kind of a word on that.
Good idea. Yep. All right.
Any other questions for Cliff and Jeff?
Coming up on an hour, so very lively hour. Thank you, everybody.
I don't have a question, but I'll say this has been really interesting.
Thanks, Mike. I agree. I've learned quite a bit.
I appreciate the time to make my questions. I sometimes ask a lot of questions. I see Nadine's on the line. She's probably rolling her eyes and smiling. And I appreciate the time. I appreciate the time for me to make my points.
Well,
I
David,
get a little enthusiastic about this
that's
stuff.
great. I mean, I learned, you're one of the people I learned something from here. I also learned some new things about the simulator. Every time I do one of these presentations, I learn something new about En-ROADS. So it's very good.
It's a cool
I
tool.
really enjoyed it.
David, I thought your questions added a lot and they certainly challenged
Yep.
Jeff, and Cliff and Jeff showed how much they knew by addressing your questions. I think it was a marvelous interaction personally.
Good.
Thank you.
Cliff and Jeff, you did a fantastic job.
Well, thank you, Cheryl. Thank you.
Really, really good. You guys know this stuff so much. Thank you for putting so much time into learning about it.
We're getting better. We're getting better.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say thanks, everyone. We did record it and we'll be sharing that with everyone as soon as we can. So I'll be on the lookout for that. And just thanks for your time tonight, and hope that everyone has a good rest of your evening.
Okay,
Okay,
thank you so
Thank you,
much.
everybody.
One thought before we close here, folks, is if anybody would like a copy of these charts, you're certainly welcome to them. Nothing proprietary here, obviously. So what I can do is perhaps provide a copy to Thad, and you can contact him and he can send them to you, or you can contact me directly. Either way.
And thanks Thaddeus and Sabrina for hosting too.
Yeah.
It was all Thad's work. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a
all.
lot.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Good night, folks.
Good night.
Bye.